So, reading in the third chapter of Freedom and Righteousness in Rune Engelbrecht Larsens book that inspired me a lot during my time of revision in the time after the cartoon crisis. And I've talked about that in other videos, how I was led to try and understand my heritage, both from the West and the East, and look into the history of ideas. And this book was very good in many ways because it summed up a lot of the things I was struggling with, and it did not put freedom or righteousness or democracy on a pink cloud and say that's your new God, that's the new way, and it's just looking at it in many ways also critically or from other perspectives. And in this third chapter, I'm gonna talk about Athena, and the book is talking about Athena, but I'm gonna reflect on that and about the struggle in Athena for democracy and freedom for the citizens, and how it became an ideal state, and the situation with Socrates and Plato that turned against that type of society they have seen as fallen into deep pits of misuse and not really reflecting the philosophers' type of state that would really give freedom and righteousness in a balance that is much needed. And so I'm gonna look into Engelbrecht Larsens' book once again here in this in this video, and how it affected me at that time. And so this is just a book of Rune here. In the second chapter, much talking about freedoms and how they are actualized, and he goes all the way back to Athena, of course, and he goes back before that and talking about the old gods from that time, and especially Zeus and his intervention with humans, and how he took over from the Titans, and the son of the Titan, Prometheus, who was a revolt against Zeus's rule and saw it as a kind of tyranny. And so he took first the meat to the humans, and then he took the fire and stole it from Olympus to give it to people so they could heat their meat before eating it. And the story is very symbolic on the fight between humans and the gods, like the ordinary people and the people with power, and how the people with power, if they act tyrannically, they can strip the ordinary human of everything, and there is nothing to stop them. And this revolting Prometheus is tortured, and his liver is grown every day on the top of the mountain, where an eagle comes and eat it every day, and then it's put back in place, and then it's all kind of persecution of that man who's trying to give the humans their freedom and their power, and opposing Zeus's leadership. And so it leads to the tragedy of the human condition, as he speaks about in this book, and that is being reflected in many stories from that time, in the poets and the story writers that were in Greece at that time. And he mentioned a lot of them here. I just don't want to go into it, but it's like the idea of freedom has been many ways suppressed and not really been a practical issue. Before we get the police states, it means the big towns with a small upland around them, the Athene and Sparta, and many other hundreds of towns that grew around the islands of the Greek, and it was that civilization that he was looking back at and back to as the light bearer for the modern civilization in the West, especially Europe, and how they are today. The actuality of democracy and citizenship and freedoms and rights is based on that old idea of the city of Athena. And so he focuses his talk on Athena, that is reflected in many historic documents and storytellers from that time, and also theaters and a lot of what is delivered to us today gives that sense of Athena as the political and cultural center where freedom became a very important issue and became like the main route to the development of that society in the end of the 6th and 5th century before our time, BC, before Christ. And in that time we can see that the cultural and political idea in Athena broke through and became and gave Athena that very special status that it upheld for a few centuries as the most important town. So it was like to enjoy the freedom and to live it was the most important thing, and to protect the individual from being suppressed or followed or taken over by anybody else became also became a rooted idea in the minds of people. And so it was called a democratic city-state, and had these 200 years from around 500 BC until 300 BC, and was at its height at that time as a big superpower, if you can say it as today. It was a city-state, but it had a big notion of many intellectuals, writers, and clever people living in it, and workers and people who are creative and innovative, and it became the hub for many people at that time, and later was studied as the most important historic city that one could tap the new ideas from. And so when we came to the age of enlightenment and afterwards, when 1800s, and Europe wanted to rise again on an idea, so became Athena one of the main focus. Of course, Rome was the other focus, and it's like modern. This is my opinion now. Modern time is like combination. Modern time Europe and the West is like a combination of both Athena and Rome, and I will talk about that in my comments later, how I reflected on this book. But that's what it seemed to me. So Athena, he's speaking about that town that had a really important place, where it was characterized as the place for the free citizen, and that free citizen was characterized in the Delphic inscriptions about Apollon's priests in Delphi, and the inscriptions were saying that the free citizen, he's the one who represents himself, and he's the one that nobody owns, and he's the one that does what he has the right to do and wants to do, and he lives where he wants to live. So these four basic freedoms were the central elements of what they understood of freedom. You represent yourself, you are nobody's property, and you can do what you like, and you can live where you like. And at the same time, it was all organized in a way so everybody could vote. When they had these around 40 times meeting a year, these free citizens, they were not many, and it didn't include everyone. There was mostly beside them slaves and some kind of people who just were foreigners and sought asylum, and they didn't get the same rights as the free citizens of Greece. But they had the right to live there and were basically protected with some notion of righteousness and protection of the foreigners. So when these free citizens met in the public gathering around 40 times a year, they had to make decisions about everything that was going on in society, politics, economics, social order, and all that, and they had to vote. And the majority of the votes made the law. And so it was, as Pericles will be the symbol of, that Athena and the way of life between freedom and righteousness became that important city that became the golden age and the prototype for building the new societies in life, and maybe not only in the West but all over the world, where people really were seeking such kind of freedom. And at the same time, it had a lot of what can you say, critical voices, and one of the main and big and important voices who said that this town was not going according to what it should was Socrates and his student Plato. We know about Socrates from Plato, but he talks about making people self-aware and aware of the society around them, how it's led, and in the end he became such an opposing force to the society as it was back then, that he was put to death by poison. And it's a very fascinating story, and I have been talking earlier in Danish about his monologue when I was reading the literature canon, and took out this monologue of Socrates and talked about it and how it was, and maybe read a lot of loud out about it. So Athena became the what can you say, the light tower of freedom and equality at that time. And so it became like the first notion of democracy, where people vote and agree on things with a vote of majority. And at the same time, you have a state that surrounds itself with values of everybody taking care of his own and the ones he owed, and the people surrounding him. So they had slaves and they had foreigners who didn't have the same rights. But basically, the basic idea was this uplifting society as a free state, as it's called here, that gives each man his right to vote. And this Athena was in many ways an opposition to some other kind of ruling forms that has been going on around Athena and outside it. And that's the tyrannical form, the oligarchic form, and the tyrannical, the kingship, the kingdomship. And so they were always in stories and talks comparing their way of life to others and looking into these three other type of ruling. And later we have a big criticism of that from Herodot, where he speaks about the oligarchic, monarchic, and tyrannical way of life, and comparing it to the democratic state, and how it makes sense to have this democratic states, of course, where everybody is equal to the law, and everyone gets his post by random picking, and then that everyone who has a post and has power is held accountable for his actions, and that everything is decided by common discussions before decision. And he says that these four virtues and these four values are the ones that makes our society stick out as different from the others. And then there is a story, and this is all built up as a story from that time. I'm not going into details, but there were other arguments for both the monarchy and for the one man's rule that has been also a part of that time. And so the others had these ideas and notions that if you take democracy to its limits and let the people decide on everything, that won't be easy, and you will get a hub of chaotic and undisciplined people who just vote randomly and not being able to uphold what's in the best interest of the state, and you will not be able to discuss everything. This is not feasible. That's why a monarch, a one man who is given the power to rule on behalf of the people, is the better way. And the third guy, he's arguing, it's like this is an argument for the one man rule, and why a strong leader is the best, because he will uphold society and pull people together, and everybody will know his place, and so on. And so that discussion from that time that has been reflected in these writers' stories and theater pieces. And this is according to Rune Engelbrecht Larsens, part of what Herodot has been writing about. So I'm actually just retelling the discussions they had at this time to like look into democracy and the Athenic state and what kind of rule is the best. And so the best argument for this democracy is that that if you let one man rule, this will make power corrupt him, and he will go after his egos and do what's best for himself and his own. It will become an oligarchy, and then it will fall, and it won't be the ideal state. And the same with having the king. It was also discussed whether that could be good for the people, who would maybe lose their true voice and their freedoms under such rule. And so basic ideas in that Athenic society at that time was that you always have to speak on behalf of the good, and the good is what's good for the common case of the town or society or the liberties of everyone. And the second thing is that equality was held very high, equality for the law. Nobody could run away because of their inheritance or family membership, or because they were leaders or a ruler or something. Everybody were accountable for the law, and that gives a big state of security. And then that in the society of Athena and freedom, you can go against the law if it goes against your conscience, because your conscience is the first and most important rule and law that you have in yourself. And you should not just adhere to the society. You should always be critical and awake and understand that what am I being led to right now, and what's going on in the political rules. Are they for my best and the common good, or is this a kind of manipulative way of letting people to be suppressed? And you have always to follow your conscience before obeying orders. So they say that this is the basic values that time had for the Athenic society. At the same time, they could see some positive thing in others, and in other societies. They were not totally blind to that, but they saw that their society were the best. It took in somehow multicultural understanding, and the idea of freedom as the most important one among any other freedom, and the acceptance of people who were in need was a very, very big issue. Everyone who were persecuted or had to run away, they saw it as the will of the god Zeus, and it was like the will of their own society, that they should rescue and help and protect everyone who had been persecuted, and give them shelter and being part of that Athenic society. And if you don't like being there, you are welcome to leave, but it will be your own right to stay or to leave. So it was open for everyone. You will never like chase foreigners away and say you don't belong here, because this was a free state. It was a state for everyone to join and to be there, and at the same time, they would not give these foreigners the same rights like to voting. So it would be like a small council of people who really have the vote and who really controls the power, and that's also to be discussed. But they say, as well as Engelbrecht Larsens here is reflecting in his book, that Athena had also given stateship and citizenship to many foreigners that came there when they put democracy into use, and in that sense were opposed to Sparta, where Sparta is really not open to foreigners, and always building on the clean and strong Spartan person who does not like people from outside, especially not weak ones or people who have been running away and being persecuted. And it seems like this Athenic society had developed. It hasn't, of course, been static. It started at one point, and then when it took on new people and took in new refugees or people who wanted to join that free state, as they say in the anti-tyrannical understanding in that time, And we have the front figure in Pericles, who was a most a big strategist and a big leader, who actually opened up for citizenship in a kind for people who came from other societies, and did not look at the class people came from in order to give them a rule. It was all divided by randomness. So people were very much included, says this book, and its idea is that Athena was the symbol of the, at that time, most heightened society in understanding the human rights and the human value and the value of freedom, and implementing it in a real life state. So this is basically to say that this society was to be looked up to and to be repeated and copied and maybe developed in these modern times. And he's not talking about that yet, but you can read it between the lines from mentioning this and looking into where we live, and you can get this, aha, okay, this is the idea behind the modern Europe and modern West, and the idea of building the state on these values of equality for the law, freedoms for everyone, and freedom to choose, and that everyone who held power was accountable, and people should talk and discuss before voting. And so later in the third part, I will be talking about the protest on this idea and the difficulties with it, with focus on Socrates and Plato, as the book itself is focusing on, and what's going on there in between that ideal and the reality. And maybe that's where Plato and Socrates comes in. But so in this part, it was like a presentation shortly about Athena and its special position, and what kind of values it upheld in its society that made it such a light tower for later centuries, and especially for the modern times, where Europe had to look back and rebuild itself on some kind of ideal, and it became the ideal for, at least in some places, to rebuild society on it.